The sky over Germany burns with contrails and flame. It's October 1943. High above the Ruhr Valley, a formation of B-17 flying fortresses crawls through the thin air at 25,000 feet. Frost crystals glitter on gun barrels. Oxygen masks hiss. Below, the dark earth turns slowly beneath them. Ahead, a swarm of Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s rises to meet them head-on. Inside the bombers, gunners brace themselves. The intercom crackles. Bandits, 12 o'clock. Tracer lines streak forward. White, orange, red, but the German fighters cut through untouched. The gunners curse, adjust, fire again. Still nothing. Seconds later, a B-17 bursts into flame, breaking apart in midair. Another spirals down in smoke. Then, one gunner, remembering something from a new training manual, hesitates. He stops trying to lead the target. He aims slightly behind. The tracers arc backward through space and slice straight into the enemy plane's path. The Messerschmitt disintegrates. In that instant, the logic of air combat changes. A small shift in how gunners saw the sky, a counterintuitive idea, would double their effectiveness and rewrite the science of shooting in motion. By the winter of 1942, the United States had fully joined the air war over Europe. From airfields in England, squadrons of B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators rumbled skyward almost daily, their four engines droning across the gray North Sea. The Allied command believed these bombers could cripple German industry through precision daylight bombing. Factories, oil refineries, and rail yards would be destroyed in bright daylight, their destruction visible through the Norden bomb sight, a machine that promised mathematical accuracy from 6 miles up. But daylight meant visibility, and visibility meant death. As the bombers crossed into occupied Europe, they entered a killing zone patrolled by the Luftwaffe's Jagdgeschwader wings. German fighters approached in disciplined packs, often head-on, diving out of the sun or climbing through the clouds in staggered formations. The Americans flew without fighter escort for much of 1943, their P-47s and P-38s limited by range. So the gunners aboard each bomber, 10 men per crew, with up to 1350 caliber machine guns, became the formation's only shield. Training films called the B-17 a flying fortress. In theory, its overlapping fields of fire formed a defensive sphere of bullets. In practice, it was an illusion. The statistics told the truth. Early in the campaign, it took nearly 3,000 rounds to bring down a single German aircraft. Over Schweinfurt, Regensburg, Bremen, losses were staggering. Dozens of bombers fell on every mission. Something was wrong. Crews complained that they could see hits striking enemy planes, flashes, sparks, smoke, yet the fighters flew on. Others never seemed to connect at all. Instructors back home blamed nerves, lack of discipline, or faulty sights. Few realized the problem was rooted not in courage or hardware, but in human perception. Air gunnery had changed faster than the human eye could adapt. During World War I, combat had been close, chaotic, and relatively slow. Pilots fired at visual range, often within a few hundred yards. By the 1940s, speeds had doubled, closure rates tripled, and attack angles multiplied. A fighter diving at 400 miles per hour could cross a gunner's field of view in 2 seconds. Hitting it required predicting not just where it was, but where it would be. U.S. training programs struggled to keep up. At Las Vegas Army Air Gunnery School in Kingman Field, Arizona, recruits learned on turret simulators, camera guns, and towed sleeve targets. They memorized rules of thumb: lead the target, aim ahead, fire in short bursts. It was sound advice for static ground targets or straight line attacks, but it failed in the three-dimensional chaos of air combat. The enemy was learning too. Luftwaffe pilots recognized that most American gunners fired too far ahead. They began to exploit the pattern, rolling into high-speed head-on passes, counting on the bombers' defensive tracers to miss high and forward. For the German pilot, a fraction of a second's misjudgment meant death. For the American gunner, the same error meant an entire formation could be cut apart. By mid-1943, the Air Force quietly acknowledged a crisis in defensive accuracy. Research teams from the Army Air Forces Board and the National Defense Research Committee, NDRC, were dispatched to analyze gunnery data. They filmed live fire exercises, tracked tracer paths, and interviewed returning crews. One finding appeared again and again. The eye could not track angular velocity correctly when the target's path crossed the sight. Gunners were instinctively leading too much, overshooting in time. What they needed wasn't more aggression, but restraint. The correction, when it came, sounded absurd. Physicists studying motion picture data realized that when two objects moved rapidly across one another's lines of sight, the brain perceived lag where there was none. To compensate, shooters naturally overled, aiming where the target seemed to be going, not where it would intersect the bullet's path. The data suggested that the correct aim point was slightly behind the visual target. At first, no one believed it. The idea contradicted everything instinct and training had taught. Yet the mathematics were unarguable. A .50 caliber round took less than a second to cover 600 yards, but in that same moment, a fighter at full throttle could change position by hundreds of feet. The bullet would meet the plane not where it appeared, but behind that image, a paradox of human vision and physics intertwined. This was the riddle that wartime America now faced. How to teach thousands of 19-year-old gunners to trust a sight picture that felt wrong, to aim behind what they wanted to hit. And in the hangars of the western desert, a handful of instructors began testing that heresy. The desert sun beat down on the airfields of the American Southwest. At Las Vegas Army Air Gunnery School, the largest of its kind, 1,000 recruits at a time learned to track and shoot under heat shimmer and dust. Rows of .30 caliber Brownings cracked against distant targets while instructors paced behind them, stopwatches in hand. By 1943, the school had become the crucible for a new kind of thinking, part science lab, part survival academy. Instructors began noticing something curious during camera gun exercises. When students aimed slightly behind the target aircraft in the film projector, their photographs, in each representing a theoretical hit, scored higher. At first it was dismissed as coincidence, but as the pattern repeated, a few instructors, guided by reports from the NDRC, started to suspect that the official doctrine on leading targets might be fundamentally wrong. Behind the flight line, physicists and engineers from Harvard's Applied Ballistics Laboratory and the University of Chicago's Ordnance Research Division were quietly analyzing those same films frame by frame. They measured tracer arcs, bullet flight times, and angular deflection. Their conclusion was startlingly consistent. Human tracking was faster than human perception. When a moving target crossed a gunner's view, the shooter's reflex made them shift the muzzle too soon, anticipating motion that was already accounted for by the bullet's travel time. The result was systematic overshoot. In modern terms, they were overleading the target. To correct it, the researchers proposed a counterintuitive training rule. Reduce your lead. For fast-crossing targets, especially head-on attacks, aim slightly behind what the eye perceives as the leading edge. This compensated for the neural lag between sight and trigger. But the notion collided headlong with years of accepted gunnery tradition. The official manual still emphasized leading your target. Airmen were drilled to visualize the point of intersection, a philosophy rooted in instinct rather than instrumentation. Now scientists were suggesting that instinct itself was the problem. Resistance was immediate. Veteran gunnery instructors scoffed at the data. "You don't hit what's behind you," one famously said. "That's how you miss." But a few men, practical, observant, and desperate to reduce bomber losses, decided to test it under live conditions. At Tyndall Field, Florida, an experimental training detachment conducted comparative shoots using frangible bullets against fast-towing drones. They recorded the results with gun cameras. Students trained to lead less achieved up to 40% higher hit probability than those following standard doctrine. The difference was especially dramatic against high-speed targets passing close aboard, the very scenario most fatal to bomber crews. The shift in thinking drew the attention of Colonel Frank McNamara, head of the Air Force's Central Gunnery Board. He authorized a revision of gunnery tables and sight calibration procedures. The board's reports began to include the phrase, apparent lag compensation. Behind that clinical term lay the seed of a revolution. To make the new concept intuitive, engineers turned to technology. The Sperry computing Gunsight, a gyroscopically stabilized sight introduced in 1943, translated relative motion into predicted impact points. As the gunner tracked a target, the gyros automatically calculated lead angle and displayed a corrected reticle. If the gunner held steady, the sight itself effectively aimed behind. For the first time, mathematics and instinct were aligned. Still, the challenge remained human. It wasn't enough to invent a new gunsight. Crews had to trust it. And trust in war came slowly. Reports from Europe told of gunners ignoring the computing sights, reverting to manual aim when under attack. Old habits, especially those linked to survival, die hard. To address this, instructors at the Army Air Force's Flexible Gunnery School at Laredo, Texas, devised a new simulation method. Using B-34 training aircraft towing radio-controlled drones, they allowed students to experience, viscerally, the moment of counterintuitive aiming. Instructors would call out, "Hold your fire, now aim behind, steady a fire." When the tracer stream curved and struck true, disbelief gave way to understanding. This wasn't theory anymore. It was muscle memory reshaped by physics. By late 1943, new manuals codified the technique. Film reels labeled deflection firing revised method were shipped to air bases from Idaho to England. One sequence showed a gunner watching a model plane sweep across a screen. The narrator's calm voice explained, "The eye deceives the hand. To hit a fast target, you must appear to aim behind it. Remember, where the target seems it has already been." It was a strange message for a generation raised on instinct and reflex. Yet it worked. Through repetition, thousands of gunners began to internalize this paradox. What began as a line of mathematical reasoning in a Harvard lab was now standard doctrine for the 8th Air Force. The real test, though, would come not in classrooms or desert ranges, but in the frozen skies over Europe, where the air was full of flak, and a man had seconds to decide whether to trust his eyes or the numbers, and that test was coming soon. At 20,000 feet, theory vanished. A bomber gunner's world was a narrow turret, a frozen gunsight, and the scream of air rushing past aluminum skin. The difference between life and death was measured in seconds, in the reflex of a single trigger pull. The U.S. Army Air Forces recruited thousands of young men into this strange role, often barely out of high school, their hands still calloused from farm tools or factory wrenches. They were taught to read angles, to sense closure rates, to react faster than fear, but nothing in their training could erase the primal instinct. To shoot at what they saw. That instinct was fatal. Gunners spoke later of the dissonance, the feeling that they were deliberately missing the enemy when aiming behind. Many described a physical hesitation, a tightening in the chest as if betraying their own survival reflex. One waist gunner from the 100th Bomb Group recalled, "Your brain tells you to pull ahead. You have to fight your brain to live." The new doctrine demanded trust, in data, in instructors, and in unseen mathematics. It asked 19-year-olds to override adrenaline with geometry. That mental shift, more than any mechanical invention, was what changed American gunnery. Those who learned to suppress instinct survived longer. Those who didn't often never came home. It was not a question of courage, but of reprogramming perception, a rare case where science had to train the body to disobey itself. And within that tension, between reflex and calculation, lay the quiet human triumph of adaptation. Every aerial engagement was a problem of geometry. Imagine two aircraft crossing paths at hundreds of miles per hour, one defending, one attacking. The apparent motion across the gunner's view was not the fighter's real speed, but a projection of angular velocity. To strike, the gunner's bullet needed to meet the fighter's future position in both space and time. Early doctrine misunderstood this dynamic. Gunners were trained to think in 2 dimensions, as if drawing a line ahead of a target. But in reality, air combat unfolded in 3. The target was not only moving laterally but also closing or receding. What appeared as a small sideways drift on the sight could represent 1,000 feet of real displacement. In 1943, a team at the Army Air Forces Board published the first true combat deflection tables. They mapped firing solutions for different angles of approach, speeds, and ranges. The tables revealed something astonishing. The optimal aim point for most fighter attack. Profiles lay behind the visible target image, sometimes by several aircraft lengths. This meant that the perfect shot looked wrong to the naked eye. Gunners trained under the new system learned to think of time, not just distance. They were taught to visualize bullet flight as a predictive curve intersecting the fighter's trajectory. The more oblique the angle, the more deceptive the apparent motion. What looked like a head-on pass was often a shallow crossing run. What seemed like a perfect lead was an overshoot. The tactical genius of aiming behind wasn't mystical. It was a correction for angular compression, the optical illusion that collapsed motion into a single deceptive line. As formations evolved, this knowledge reshaped bomber defense. Crews began coordinating fields of fire with precise sector overlap. Instead of chasing fighters with frantic bursts, gunners were instructed to hold steady tracking shots, letting the enemy fly into their stream of fire. The tactic reduced wasted ammunition and increased hit probability dramatically. By late 1943, after-action reports began showing a subtle but consistent shift. Fewer random bursts, more controlled kills. The sky was still chaos, but the chaos was now calculated. Technology turned theory into instinct. Before 1943, most bomber turrets used simple ring and bead or reflex sights. These devices required the gunner to estimate speed, range, and angle manually, an impossible task in real combat. The result was overcorrection, wasted ammunition, and missed shots. The arrival of the K3 and K13 computing gunsights, developed by Sperry Gyroscope Company, changed everything. Using a small gyroscope linked to the sight reticle, these systems automatically adjusted the aim point as the gunner tracked a moving target. The faster the target crossed the field of view, the more the sight compensated. In essence, it was a mechanical brain, a predictive analog computer that calculated lead angles faster than any human could. When a gunner kept the target centered, the gyros introduced the necessary lag correction automatically. The result? Bullets landed not where the gunner appeared to aim, but where physics dictated they should. But the real innovation wasn't mechanical. It was psychological. Gunners began to trust the machine more than their eyes. They learned to track smoothly, to resist the urge to snap fire. Instructors emphasized, hold the target, don't chase it. The Sperry sights rewarded calm, deliberate tracking with near miraculous accuracy. The technology translated scientific abstraction into physical feedback. Every successful hit reinforced the new intuition that aiming behind was no longer wrong, but right. By early 1944, computing gun sights became standard in most heavy bombers, marking one of the earliest battlefield uses of analog computation. It was a quiet revolution, one that would later inspire post-war jet gun sights and even early missile guidance systems. The gunners might not have understood the mathematics spinning inside those gyros, but they saw the results in smoke and falling aircraft, and that was proof enough. The technology could teach the hands what the mind resisted, but to truly master this paradox of perception, the Air Force would need more than machines. It would need to reshape training, leadership, and even the understanding of the enemy itself. War accelerates discovery like nothing else. By 1943, the problem of missed targets had evolved from a military nuisance into a full-scale scientific investigation inside temporary wooden laboratories at Eglin Field, Florida, and university campuses across the United States. Physicists, psychologists, and mathematicians studied the mechanics of vision and motion with the urgency of survival. The National Defense Research Committee, NDRC, assigned teams to measure what they called tracking error lag, the time delay between the eye's observation of motion and the finger's reaction on a trigger. Using oscillographs and rotating targets, they mapped the milliseconds of human hesitation. Their findings were sobering. Under combat stress, the average lag could exceed 1/10 of a second. In that brief interval, a fast-moving fighter could displace hundreds of feet, enough to turn a perfect aim into a total miss. The aim-behind principle, therefore, was not philosophical. It was compensatory, a way of building physiology into geometry. Scientists such as Dr. Carl Helmholtz and Dr. Edwin Link, pioneers of gunnery simulation, demonstrated that the human brain perceived angular velocity as nonlinear. The faster an object crossed the visual field, the more the brain underestimated its true speed. Shooters instinctively overled because they were trying to catch up to a mental image already behind real time. To fix this, the NDRC proposed a radical training overhaul, teach gunners to deceive their senses. The goal was no longer instinctive shooting, but predictive computation. Every student would learn to think like a physicist under fire. The results, when integrated into live fire training, validated the theory beyond dispute. Controlled studies showed up to a 60% increase in hit probability among students trained with motion film analysis and delayed lead principles. In a sense, the air gunner became the first practical fusion of soldier and scientist, a man guided by equations even as flak burst around him. And those equations, simple, precise, merciless, were now rewriting the doctrine of war in the sky. Innovation rarely travels easily through bureaucracy. Within the U.S. Army Air Forces, command structures were steeped in tradition. Doctrine flowed from the top down, not the other way around. Yet the aim behind revelation began quietly from the ground up, from instructors and field reports, not generals. It took a few visionary officers to recognize its potential. One was Colonel Frank A. McNamara, chief of the Central Gunnery Board. Reviewing combat footage from 8th Air Force missions, McNamara noticed that the few gunners scoring consistent kills shared one odd trait. Their tracers appeared to trail the target, not precede it. When analyzed frame by frame, those misses turned out to be direct hits. McNamara ordered further trials. The data was undeniable. In a confidential memo circulated in late 1943, he wrote, "Training emphasis on forward deflection is producing systematic overshoot. Recommend immediate revision to include perceptual lag correction." The bureaucratic machine moved slowly, but by early 1944, new training circulars began incorporating these findings. Gunnery manuals were rewritten, diagrams redrawn. The phrase "lead as instinct directs" was replaced with "track and hold through sight intersection." It was subtle, almost invisible, but it marked the first official acceptance of aiming behind the apparent motion. McNamara's leadership, echoed by others like General Ira Eaker in the 8th Air Force, turned a laboratory theory into a doctrine of survival. Leaders understood that this wasn't just about physics, it was about morale. The daylight bombing campaign's success hinged on gunner confidence. The men had to believe their weapons worked. When they saw tracers connect more often, that belief returned. The best commanders were those who listened, to instructors, to crews, even to the scientists in lab coats far from the front. They recognized that courage alone could not overcome error, but understanding could across the channel. The Luftwaffe was watching. In 1943, German pilots considered American bombers formidable but predictable. Their defensive fire was heavy, but most bursts went wide or high. Veteran aces like Adolf Galland and Egon Mayer developed precise tactics to exploit that weakness. Fast frontal attacks, oblique passes, or climbing rolls through the blind spots between turrets. The strategy relied on one fact, that American gunners consistently overshot. For months it worked. Then suddenly, the pattern shifted. Reports filtered through Luftwaffe squadrons. Attacks that once seemed safe now ended abruptly in tracer fire. Fighters struck by converging streams they couldn't see coming. German intelligence officers studying gun camera footage noticed a new style of defensive shooting. Tighter groupings, fewer wasted bursts, deadly accuracy during crossing passes. At first, they suspected improved weapons or radar-guided turrets. Some even believed the Americans had developed proximity fuses for machine guns. But the truth was simpler and more unsettling. The bombers were learning faster than the attackers could adapt. By mid-1944, Luftwaffe pilots reported that direct head-on approaches were suicidal. Many reverted to high 6 o'clock attacks or dive-and-zoom passes. The dynamic of the air war had changed. The aim behind correction had disrupted not only training but the enemy's confidence. Every change in doctrine echoes through its opposite number. For every innovation in defense, the attacker must find a new weakness. By teaching gunners to perceive motion differently, the U.S. Air Forces forced the Luftwaffe to alter its tactics, a ripple effect that bought vital months for the Allied bombing offensive to intensify. It was not a secret weapon, nor a new machine. It was a shift of mind, invisible yet decisive, and it set the stage for what would happen next. When those same lessons met the fury of combat, when the theory would be proven not in classrooms or charts, but in fire and steel over Europe's heartland. The morning of February 20th, 1944, dawned clear over England. From airfields scattered across East Anglia, the roar of engines rolled through the mist. It was the beginning of Operation Argument. the opening strike of what would become known as Big Week. Hundreds of B-17s and B-24s, their fuselages painted with the names of sweethearts and hometowns, lumbered down runways and lifted into the pale sky. Their targets lay deep inside Germany: aircraft factories, assembly plants, and repair depots, the heart of the Luftwaffe's production network. The mission was ambitious, almost reckless. The 8th Air Force would hit the Reich's industrial core directly, under full daylight with limited fighter escort. The Luftwaffe would throw everything it had to stop them. Among the crews flying that morning were dozens of gunners trained under the new doctrine, the men who had learned to ignore instinct and aim behind. Many carried the newly issued K-13 computing gunsight, and all had drilled the mantra into muscle memory: track hold, lag, then fire. As the bomber stream crossed the Dutch coast, the sky filled with contrails twisting like pale ropes. German radar stations picked them up instantly. Sirens wailed across airfields from Münster to Brunswick. Within minutes, swarms of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs were climbing to intercept. At 25,000 feet, the first formations met the enemy. The attack came as expected: high-speed head-on passes, cannon shells bursting in white flashes. In the waist and tail turrets, the gunners worked like machines, calling bearings, rotating in perfect arcs. The air vibrated with the rhythm of synchronized 50-caliber fire. Then, something different happened. Instead of leading the fighters as before, the gunners held their sights just behind the oncoming shapes, steady, patient, trusting the data. The tracers seemed to curve backward through empty space. To the untrained eye, it looked wrong, but the results were immediate. A B-17 from the 91st Bomb Group, callsign Shoo Shoo Baby, reported 2 confirmed kills within minutes. The waist gunner's rounds intersected a diving FW-190 at exactly the predicted point of lag correction. The fighter disintegrated mid-roll. Another gunner aboard Miss Manuki described it later. "I aimed where he'd been, not where he was going. He flew straight into it." Observers and escorting fighters noticed the change too. The sky lit with concentrated bursts instead of scattered lines. The bomber boxes, once porous, now looked like moving fortresses in truth, their defenses precise, converging. Efficient Luftwaffe pilots accustomed to predictable overshoot found themselves flying into invisible walls of fire. The tactical manuals that had guided them since 1941 were suddenly obsolete. The mission was brutal. Out of nearly 1,000 bombers, more than 60 were lost that day, but for the first time, German losses matched, and in some sectors exceeded, the attackers. Over Brunswick alone, American gunners claimed 68 enemy aircraft destroyed, a figure later confirmed by Luftwaffe loss reports to be remarkably accurate. When crews returned to their airfields that evening, blackened by gun smoke and frost, something had changed. The briefing rooms that once echoed with frustration now buzzed with disbelief and pride. Gun camera footage showed the proof: fighters crumbling in midair, hit by clean, timed bursts. The after-action reports were cautious but clear. New training techniques and improved sighting methods producing measurable increase in enemy casualties. Recommend expansion of revised gunnery doctrine to all combat groups. The data reached Colonel McNamara's board within days. For months, the idea had been theoretical, a laboratory correction buried in technical manuals. Now it had blooded itself in the crucible of Big Week. In the following days, the experiment continued. Every major raid, Gotha, Leipzig, Schweinfurt once more, became a proving ground for this new form of marksmanship. Gun crews rotated between squadrons, spreading the method like wildfire. Within weeks, the aim-behind principle was no longer whispered theory. It was standard fieldcraft, and the numbers told their own story. Before Big Week, the 8th Air Force's average defensive hit rate stood at roughly 2%, 2 hits for every 100 rounds fired. By March 1944, that figure had climbed past 4%. It was still brutally low, but in the mathematics of massed air combat, that doubling of accuracy was transformative. It meant more German fighters destroyed, fewer bombers falling, more men returning home. The U.S. Army Air Forces had found a way to turn the laws of motion and the flaws of human sight into a weapon. But the real climax was still unfolding. In the months ahead, as the Allies pushed toward Normandy and beyond, the new doctrine would encounter its ultimate test: prolonged daylight raids deep into Germany's industrial heartland. where the sky itself became a battlefield of evolving tactics. And in those battles, the meaning of aiming behind would evolve from technique to instinct, a quiet revolution written in fire across the European sky. The weeks after Big Week confirmed what a handful of scientists and instructors had suspected all along, that perception itself could be weaponized. By March 1944, the revised gunnery doctrine was spreading across the Allied air forces like a hidden current. Instructors from the 8th Air Force circulated field memoranda summarizing the method in one simple sentence. When in doubt, aim behind. It was not poetry. It was survival. Every gunner who had lived through Big Week carried the lesson forward. At briefings before raids on Berlin, Leipzig, and Regensburg, the message was repeated like a catechism. Crews studied still frames of gun camera footage tracing the arc of tracers and the point of impact. The key was consistency, track smoothly, lag the target, fire in short controlled bursts. By April, bomber groups were integrating lag pursuit drills into their daily schedules. At Thorpe Abbott's, home of the 100th Bomb Group, gunners practiced on towed banners over the North Sea. They watched their tracers curve gently behind the moving target, trusting the delayed intersection. The first hits that tore through canvas proved what charts and tables could not. The human mind could be retrained. In Europe's frozen air, that retraining saved lives. When the 8th Air Force resumed heavy bombing over Berlin in March 1944, the Luftwaffe threw its last reserves into the sky. Waves of Bf-109s and FW-190s, many flown by hastily trained pilots, struck the bomber columns with desperate ferocity. They expected the same wild defensive fire as before, the telltale arcs of tracers leading too far ahead. Instead, they flew into precise measured curtains of bullets. Observers from escorting P-47 Thunderbolts recorded the effect. Fighters were breaking apart mid-dive, often at extreme range. Gunners no longer fired sporadically but held steady, letting the enemy's momentum do the work. It was a subtle choreography of physics and nerve. The gunner anchored in his turret, the fighter slicing through air, the invisible geometry between them closing in fractions of a second. Each shot was a calculation made in instinctive silence. By the summer of 1944, the U.S. Strategic Air Forces were recording kill ratios never before seen in the European campaign. Statistical analyses by the Operational Research Section, ORS, revealed that bomber defensive effectiveness had nearly doubled compared to early 1943. The findings were circulated in classified reports under the dry heading, "Improvements in Aerial Gunnery Accuracy." Behind those words were thousands of lives spared. The Luftwaffe's losses grew catastrophic. By the time of the Normandy landings, the German fighter arm was bleeding beyond replacement. Many veteran pilots had been killed in engagements where the old tactics, frontal assault, quick pass, zoom climb, simply no longer worked. American gunners were now anticipating them perfectly. Interrogations of captured Luftwaffe pilots revealed growing frustration. Some described seeing phantom fire, bursts that seemed to materialize behind them, striking from impossible angles. Others spoke of bombers whose gunners never missed. What they couldn't know was that nothing supernatural had changed, only perception. Refined by mathematics as 1944 wore on, the results fed back into further innovation. The A1C computing site, an advanced evolution of the Sperry system, incorporated automatic range estimation through angular rate sensing, the culmination of thousands of data points collected from combat gunners. With it, the correction for lag and lead became almost seamless, but even with machines doing the math, the essence of the doctrine remained human. Stay calm, stay steady, trust the lag. Veterans would later recall how unnatural it still felt. The sight picture always slightly off, the enemy's plane never quite under the reticle when they fired. Yet the reward was visible in smoke and falling wreckage. One tail gunner from the 390th Bomb Group described it years later. "You learned not to chase him. Let him come to you. The sight tells you where he's really going, not where your eyes think he is. Once you trust that, you start living longer." By late 1944, gunnery training had become almost scientific ritual. Every base in England, Italy, and the Pacific used film-based target analysis and motion compensation drills. What began as a quiet correction in perception had turned into a central pillar of American aerial doctrine. The results extended far beyond Europe. In the Pacific theater, the same principle helped B-24 gunners counter Japan's Agile Zero fighters, whose turning battles once made them nearly untouchable. Even against the swift, lightly armored Japanese aircraft, the aim-behind philosophy worked, not by overpowering, but by outthinking. The final proof came in the closing months of the war, during raids deep into Germany in early 1945. Despite overwhelming flak and worsening weather, the bomber streams lost fewer planes per sortie than at any time in the previous 2 years. Analysts later concluded that improved gunnery, rooted in lag compensation, was a primary factor. For the men who flew those missions, the change wasn't abstract. It was the difference between hearing the call bail out and making it home to a warm mess hall. By the war's end, the concept that once seemed absurd, that to hit a target, you must aim behind it, had become accepted fact, embedded in manuals, training reels, and the collective instinct of airmen. It had begun as an academic correction buried in laboratory data. It ended as one of the quiet revolutions that defined the air war's outcome. And when the last bombers returned from the final raids over Germany, their gunners, frostbitten, weary, deafened by gunfire, carried not just the weight of survival, but the knowledge that understanding motion had given them power over it. When the war in Europe finally drew toward its close in spring 1945, the numbers told their own story, cold, statistical, and unmistakable. From the height of the bomber offensive in late 1943 to the end of hostilities in May 1945, the U.S. Army Air Forces recorded a staggering evolution in their defensive kill ratios, where once it took nearly 20,000 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition to bring down a single enemy fighter, that figure had dropped to less than 10,000. In purely numerical terms, it was efficiency. In human terms, it was survival. Those improved odds translated into lives, crews that made it back to base rather than vanishing over hostile territory. During the final year of the air war, bomber loss rates declined steadily despite flying deeper into Germany and facing a Luftwaffe growing more desperate by the day. The Operational Research Section, ORS, credited several factors: long-range fighter escorts, declining German pilot quality, improved formation tactics. Yet buried in the data tables was a subtler line: defensive accuracy enhanced through adoption of revised tracking methods. That bland phrasing concealed one of the quiet triumphs of modern applied science. By reframing the way airmen perceived motion, the Allies had effectively rewritten instinct. The concept of aiming behind had proven that even under chaos, at 25,000 feet, with frostbitten fingers and trembling oxygen lines, the human brain could be trained to think in terms of equations, not reflexes. The doctrine also transformed training itself. Gunnery schools across the United States and Britain rewrote their curricula. Trainees spent hours in synthetic trainers, watching projected film of incoming aircraft, their task not to react but to anticipate, to lag the image, feel the geometry of interception. At Tyndall Field, Florida, instructors compared students trained under the old lead pursuit model to those using lag-based correction. The results were stark. The latter group scored nearly double in target accuracy under simulated combat conditions. The findings circulated in classified reports, eventually influencing all branches of the service. Even outside the Air Forces, the principle found resonance. Naval anti-aircraft batteries, plagued by similar perception errors when firing at dive-bombing aircraft, began experimenting with predictive sights based on the same logic. The British Royal Navy's Gyro rate unit was refined directly from the same mathematics, a lineage that led, decades later, to the first fly-by-wire targeting computers. But amid the statistics and technology, the emotional aftermath was quieter, harder to measure. For many gunners, the war had become a study in trust, not faith in luck but in logic. The men who survived spoke less about heroism and more about learning to believe the data. They had seen how a fraction of a second, a few inches of difference in sight alignment, could separate life from death. Those who didn't survive often left behind gun camera footage that told their own silent testimony, bursts of tracers arcing through cloud, the rhythm of training made instinctive. Historians would later note how these films captured more than combat. They recorded the moment when human reflex began to merge with computation. The Luftwaffe, for its part, never fully recovered from the sudden reversal. As production collapsed and fuel ran out, its surviving pilots faced a defensive war against a mathematically precise enemy. By late 1944, the German command had ordered new fighter tactics, steeper dives, longer ranges, greater dispersion, but the damage was irreversible. The fortresses were no longer easy prey, and as the skies over Europe fell silent, Allied analysts began the process of understanding why. Reports filed from every combat group returned to a single conclusion. Accuracy was no longer a matter of instinct, it was a matter of science. From the laboratories of MIT to the frozen gun turrets over Berlin, the same truth echoed through cables and debriefs alike. When men learned to aim behind what they saw, they found a way to see ahead of what was coming. That realization would shape far more than the air war. When peace finally settled over Europe in May 1945, the airfields that had once thundered with engines now lay quiet. Rows of B-17s and B-24s stood motionless under gray English skies, relics of an industrial war that had fused man and machine into something new. In Washington and Dayton, a different battle began, the battle to understand what had been learned. At Wright Field, analysts pored over thousands of combat reports, gunnery films, and test records. The data painted a startling picture. A subtle shift in perception had produced measurable strategic change. Simply teaching men to aim behind had doubled lethality and altered the balance of the air war. The U.S. Army Air Force's post-war evaluation, Report 6512, applied gunnery methods in combat aircraft, concluded with words that would echo through decades of military training. Accuracy is the product not of strength or courage, but of comprehension, the mind's ability to predict, not react. That principle became the seed of a new philosophy of warfare, one that would define the Cold War era. As jet propulsion and supersonic flight replaced propellers, the physics of aiming grew even more complex, but the logic remained. In the 1950s, engineers designing the F-86 Sabre's A-1CM radar gunsight cited the same foundational theory used by World War II's Sperry and K-13 systems. The core idea, lead correction through rate prediction, was now fully automated. The pilot no longer had to aim behind consciously. The machine did it for him. The same mathematics extended into missile guidance, radar tracking, and even computer gaming decades later. Every heat-seeking missile that curves toward its target owes something to the equations born in those 1943 training rooms. A blend of physics, probability, and human adaptation. But the legacy wasn't only technical, it was psychological. For the men who had fought in the air, the aim-behind lesson represented more than technique. It was a reordering of instinct. It had taught them that survival depended on resisting what felt natural, trusting an invisible truth beneath perception. In post-war interviews, veterans often spoke of that discipline as something they carried for life. One gunner years later described it quietly. "We learned to stop chasing what we saw. That changes you. You start seeing the world differently, not as it is, but as it's moving." That way of thinking, predictive, detached, analytical, would soon shape not just aviation but every field touched by modern computation. Early human factors research, cybernetics, and control theory all drew from wartime experiments in gunnery and perception. The aim-behind doctrine became a case study in how training could overcome the brain's optical illusions. By the 1960s, as America entered the jet age and later Vietnam, the principle had matured into an entire discipline, predictive engagement theory. Every radar-guided cannon, every infrared missile, every anti-aircraft computer that measured closure rate was, in essence, an heir to that same wartime discovery, that the human eye is slow, but the mind can be trained to think faster, even today, in the glass cockpits of F-35s and drones orbiting high above modern battlefields. Targeting algorithms use predictive lag, the digital descendant of that 1944 idea. Pilots no longer aim behind, but their systems do, invisibly and instantly. History remembers the great weapons, the bombers, the fighters, the guns, but often forgets the small revolutions that made them effective. This was one of them, a correction so counterintuitive, so deceptively simple, that it quietly reshaped the art of war. By changing where men looked, it changed what they could do. As the last of the wartime gunners faded into history, their legacy lived on in equations and circuit boards, and in the silent precision of guided weapons that never miss. The lesson they left behind was not one of glory, but of understanding, that mastery over motion begins with the courage to doubt one's own eyes. And so, long after the smoke of Europe's skies had cleared, the echo of that idea remained, a whisper from another era reminding every soldier, scientist, and strategist of the same quiet truth. To hit what matters most, sometimes you must aim behind it. War has always forced humanity to confront its own limits, of courage, of invention, of perception. The story of the aim behind doctrine is not one of heroics in the usual sense. It is a story of humility before physics, of men who learned that instinct could lie, and that truth could hide behind what the eye believed. In those frozen gun turrets above Europe, surrounded by smoke and chaos, a generation of young airmen discovered that survival was not just a matter of bravery, but of understanding motion itself. They learned that the universe moves in curves and delays, and that every target, every moment is already shifting. Their lesson outlasted the war. It became part of how modern humanity interacts with technology, trusting systems that see faster, think deeper, and correct our own perceptual flaws. From the radar screen to the guided missile, from the jet fighter to the drone, the same invisible logic flows. Anticipate, adjust, and act where the world will be. Not where it is, but beyond equations and engineering. There was something profoundly human in it. To aim behind was to accept imperfection, to admit that the senses deceive, and that reason must guide where emotion cannot. It was a lesson in patience under terror, in clarity amid noise. History often celebrates invention through its hardware, the bombers, the engines, the guns. Yet the most powerful innovations are often those of thought. Small corrections in how we see the world that open vast new possibilities. The men who learned to aim behind the target were not just gunners, they were the first practitioners of a modern truth, one that applies far beyond combat, that to master any moving world, one must first understand its delay. Their calm in that realization, their faith in invisible mathematics amid chaos, remains one of the quiet triumphs of the Second World War. And perhaps, in that stillness above the clouds, they glimpsed what all of war's lessons ultimately reveal. That understanding, not strength, is what truly changes the outcome.